The women entered the mess hall, eyes darting across the unfamiliar, yet somehow comforting scene. The guards, once feared enemies, were now simply men cooking breakfast. A heavy, unfamiliar tension pulled at their stomachs, not from hunger but disbelief. The warm, familiar scent of bacon swirled in the air, and a cowboy, eyes crinkling with amusement, offered them a tray. His voice was gentle, but the words were a shock to their system. "She cooks like my grandmother." The juxtaposition of warmth, laughter, and kindness was enough to shake their foundation. They had been told that American soldiers were nothing more than heartless killers, but the reality was far more complicated and far more dangerous. The taste of bacon would soon unravel what they thought they knew about honor, about enemy, and about survival. This moment was just the beginning of a transformation they never saw coming. They hesitated at the doorway, uncertainty and suspicion coursing through their veins. The cold, hard lessons they had been taught about the enemy surged back. The cruelty of the Americans, their supposed indifference to human suffering. In their minds, any act of kindness could only be a ploy, a cruel trick. A part of them told them to refuse the food, to reject this unexpected mercy, to cling to the beliefs drilled into them since childhood. But their stomachs growled, protesting the empty promises of honor and loyalty. The hunger clawed at them, more visceral than the fear that had dominated them up until now. Their limbs felt weak, their mouths dry, but their pride kept them still. One woman, her face pale with malnutrition, clenched her fists. She refused to look at the food in front of her, as if by ignoring it, she could erase the feeling of guilt creeping in. But despite herself, her eyes flickered toward the tray, to the food that seemed to shimmer with abundance. Bacon, eggs, coffee. Each item looked so perfect, so untouched by the ravages of war, that it almost felt unreal. Could it really be? Her hands trembled, and before she could stop herself, she reached forward and took the tray, feeling the weight of it in her hands. Her fingers, skeletal and weak, grasped the metal tray, but her mind could not process what she was holding. This wasn't supposed to be the reality. The enemy wasn't supposed to treat them like this. Yet here it was. The first bite of bacon was all it took. It sizzled in her mouth, salty, rich, and overwhelming. The taste of fat, the warmth, the tenderness, it shattered something inside of her. She was not in the midst of a battlefield anymore. She was not in a place of hunger, of fighting, of constant death. She was sitting at a table with her enemies, and they were feeding her. Another woman beside her gasped, unable to hold back the tears that welled in her eyes. She had been taught that to eat with the enemy was to degrade herself. But here she was, eating food made by their hands, something her family back home could only dream of. The hunger, the gnawing emptiness that had consumed her for so long, began to quiet, but so did the rigid beliefs she had clung to. The realization hit her like a wave. The kindness wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a trick. It was real. And with that, something changed in the room. The others, still standing by the door, watching with wide eyes, began to move. Some hesitated, some watched the first woman, but the hunger was undeniable. Slowly, each of them reached for the food. One by one, they took the tray, stared at it for a moment as if in disbelief, then dug in. The bacon was as thick and salty as they remembered, and the eggs were cooked to perfection. For the first time in months, they felt warmth in their bellies, not just from the food, but from the sheer shock of this unexpected reality. It wasn't just the food, it was the fact that they had been seen, that someone had cared enough to feed them. The American soldiers, standing quietly by, watched them eat, but they did not mock them. There were no sneers, No jeering comments. One cowboy looked over at the women, his face softening as he muttered to his friend, "She cooks like my grandmother." It wasn't a compliment they were used to. They had been told to expect cruelty, humiliation, and shame at every turn. They had been taught that surrender meant death, that any kindness would be fleeting, a trick before the real horror began. But in that moment, as they chewed their food, it felt as if everything they had been taught had been wrong. The words, "She cooks like my grandmother," hung in the air, settling between them like a quiet revelation. This act of kindness wasn't just about the meal. It wasn't just the bacon. It was about something far deeper, a reminder that there was humanity even in the unlikeliest of places. That realization chipped away at the walls of their fear, of their resistance. They had been taught to see their captors as monsters, as enemies. But this was something else entirely. For the first time in a long time, they had been treated as human beings. For a long moment, the room fell silent. The woman, who had been the first to take a bite, trembled as she lowered the tray. She looked down at the food in her hands, and then slowly, a tear rolled down her cheek. It wasn't just the food, it was the overwhelming realization of what was happening, what they were being offered, and the emotional wall that had held her together for so long finally cracked. She had been taught that surrender meant disgrace, that accepting food from an enemy would be the ultimate humiliation. But now, with the bacon in her mouth, she couldn't hold it in anymore. She wept, not from the taste, but from the conflict inside her. For the first time, the weight of everything, the years of hardship, of hunger, of fear, hit her with the force of a tidal wave. The other women watched, their eyes wide, unsure of how to react. Some shifted uneasily, their mouths still closed around the food, unsure whether to swallow, to accept, or to turn away. They had all been raised on the same beliefs. To accept food from the enemy was to accept defeat. It was to let go of everything they had known, to relinquish their pride, to dishonor their ancestors, their families, their emperor. And yet, here they were, surrounded by the very people they had been taught to despise, being treated with more care than they had ever imagined possible. It felt wrong. It felt like betrayal. But the hunger was undeniable. The food was real, and their bodies, so starved, so weak, couldn't refuse it any longer. One woman, sitting beside the weeping woman, shifted uncomfortably. She looked down at her own tray, her fingers curling around the metal, her mind at war with itself. What was the right thing to do? To deny the food was to deny survival. To accept it, to fill her stomach, was to accept the humanity of her captors. And that thought, that small, fragile thought, unsettled her in ways she couldn't yet understand. The others in the room shifted nervously, their eyes darting around, their expressions hardening into masks of uncertainty. There was no denying the food. It was right there in front of them, waiting. But what were they really accepting by eating it? They had been told that American soldiers were monsters, that they would be starved, humiliated, and tortured. Yet, in front of them were men who had not only fed them, but treated them like people. How could they reconcile that with everything they had been taught? How could they turn their backs on what their commanders had promised? On the image of the enemy that had been drilled into their minds since childhood? The tension in the room began to ease, but the emotional weight remained. They had accepted the food, but the true reckoning was not with the meal, it was with themselves. To accept food was to accept defeat, yes, but it was also to accept survival. It was to acknowledge that survival was more important than pride, more important than honor. It was to admit that they were not invincible, that they had been broken by the war, by their own beliefs. The taste of bacon, the warmth of the stew, was not just nourishment for the body, it was nourishment for the soul. A reminder that survival often requires us to let go of the things that keep us bound to our past, our pride, our pain. As the women continued to eat, the silence in the room deepened. The emotional complexity of the moment hung heavily in the air. Some women couldn't stop themselves from crying, the tears mixing with the broth in their bowls. For others, the food was almost too much to handle. The sweetness of the stew, the richness of the bacon, felt like too much of a contrast to the bitter years they had just endured. And yet, there was no turning back. The walls that had once divided them from their captors were beginning to crumble, not because of the food, but because of the humanity it represented. Slowly, tentatively, the women looked at one another, their faces still full of disbelief, but also something else, something that hadn't been there before: acceptance. They had been taught to resist, to fight. But now, in the quiet of the mess hall, they had begun to accept something even more difficult: that survival sometimes means surrendering what you thought you knew about the world and about yourself. The woman who had prepared the meal sat quietly in the corner, wiping her hands on a towel. She was no different from the women around her, perhaps even younger. She worked diligently alongside the cowboys, moving through the mess hall with practiced ease. Her uniform wasn't like theirs, but the look on her face, the way she carried herself, was familiar. She wasn't a soldier, nor a prisoner. She was simply another woman in a world turned upside down. And yet, there she was, cooking, serving, washing dishes, and being treated with respect by the men. For a moment, the POWs couldn't believe their eyes. How could she be on the same side as the men who had taken them captive? How could she be working for the enemy when she seemed so much like them? They watched her from their seats, their gazes lingering in curiosity. The woman, who had just served them food, wasn't the enemy they had been taught to fear. She wasn't cruel or taunting. She moved through the kitchen like any woman back home would have, cooking and tending to meals with care. It was almost unbearable to think of someone so similar to them doing the very things their mothers or sisters had once done. Yet, here she was, an American, a civilian, working with the very people who had brought them to this place. As they watched her, a question began to form. Could this woman really be their enemy? She didn't fit the image they had been taught to fear. She didn't carry a weapon, nor did she bark orders. She simply cooked and served, and the more they saw her, the more they found themselves asking, was she really the enemy? This inner conflict deepened as they realized she was doing the work that had always been reserved for women like them back home. In their world before the war, women cooked, cared for their families, and kept the home. But here, it wasn't them, it was her, and that thought unsettled them. How could she be their enemy if she was doing the same things they had always done? The act of cooking something so familiar, so domestic, had always been a symbol of care and warmth. And yet, here she was, a woman from the enemy camp, offering them that same care. How could they accept this? The emotional and psychological impact of seeing her in this role was overwhelming. For so long, they had been taught that the enemy was ruthless, heartless, and inhuman. But here was a woman, working alongside the men, feeding them with kindness. It was a shock to their system, a reminder that the lines between good and evil weren't as clear as they had once thought. This woman, who had cooked for them with no malice, had become a symbol not of their enemy, but of the complexity of war itself. In the quiet of the mess hall, as they continued to eat, they realized something they hadn't considered before. Their captors weren't monsters. The woman wasn't a symbol of their hatred, but a person, a woman who had been doing what they had once done: cooking, caring, feeding. And with that realization came a deep, unsettling truth. If this woman, who they had been taught to fear, could show them such kindness, what else had they been wrong about? What did it mean for their beliefs, for their understanding of who the enemy truly was? As they finished their meal, the weight of this new knowledge settled in. The barriers between them and the Americans had begun to dissolve. And while the road to understanding was still unclear, the first cracks in their hatred had begun to show. The question lingered in the air. If the enemy could offer kindness, what did that say about their own beliefs? What did it say about the war itself? The following days in the camp took on a rhythm. The women, once wary and distant, found themselves gradually shifting. It started with small things: a glance exchanged between one of them and a cowboy, a smile that didn't feel forced, an understanding that seemed to come without words. The food, which had initially been a source of suspicion, became something different altogether. No longer just a survival tool, it became an opportunity. The act of eating was no longer a necessity alone. It was a bridge, connecting them to something beyond mere hunger. And slowly, they began to contribute, to help, and to learn. One day, as they sat in the mess hall, a cowboy, his face tanned from long days in the sun, came over with a smile and a small sack of flour. "Anyone know how to make biscuits?" he asked, his voice light, almost playful. There was silence at first, no one sure how to respond. One of the women, her face still guarded, hesitated, but then she nodded. She had seen her mother bake bread in their small home before the war. The cowboy, sensing the change, knelt down beside her, showing her how to sift the flour, to mix the dough, and finally, to shape the biscuits. At first, her hands were awkward, stiff from years of fighting against hunger. But as she worked, her fingers began to remember the motions. She could feel the warmth of the dough, the simple pleasure of shaping it. She hadn't realized how much she missed that: the feel of real food, the rhythm of preparing it with care. The other women watched from their seats, their eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and disbelief. It wasn't just the act of cooking that caught their attention, it was the way the cowboy treated her, with kindness, patience, and respect. He didn't rush her, didn't bark orders. He simply showed her, step by step, until the dough was ready. In that moment, the power dynamics of captivity shifted slightly. They weren't prisoners and captors anymore. They were people, connecting through the simple, timeless act of preparing a meal. It was a moment of shared humanity, an exchange of cultures, of skills that had been passed down through generations. The women, once prisoners in body and mind, were now partaking in something they had not expected learning. The process of cooking became a form of cultural exchange, a way to build bridges without words. As the biscuits baked in the oven, the smell began to fill the room. It was the first time the women had smelled such a thing in months. The warmth of the biscuits was almost overwhelming, and when they took their first bites, it was like a revelation. It wasn't just the food itself, it was the realization that they were being treated like people again. The food, the care, the time spent together, it all began to feel like a gift. The women looked at each other, their expressions softening, and slowly they began to talk. They asked questions about the ingredients, about how the cowboys had learned to cook. They spoke about their families, their homes, and the ways they used to prepare food before the war. As the days passed, the women began to participate more in the meal preparation. Some of them started to help wash dishes, while others worked alongside the cowboys to prepare vegetables or mix dough. The act of cooking became a form of emotional healing. a way to move beyond the pain of the past. It transcended the walls of the camp, transcended the roles of captor and captive, and became a way to understand each other. They learned not just about ingredients or recipes, but about each other. They learned that survival wasn't just about food, it was about the connections they made, the shared moments, and the quiet kindness that had been offered to them when they least expected it. Through these small acts of kindness, teaching, cooking, listening, they began to rebuild a sense of dignity. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were living again, in a way they hadn't thought possible in this strange, hostile world. And in the warmth of the kitchen, the simple joy of sharing a meal, they discovered something that transcended the war. They discovered that sometimes the greatest gifts aren't given in grand gestures. They're given in biscuits, in coffee, in the care and patience that comes with offering someone the chance to learn. As the days passed, the tension in the camp began to ease. The women, once quiet and reserved, began to engage with their captors in a way they hadn't before. It started with small exchanges over meals, questions about the food, the ingredients, even casual talk about life before the war. The kitchen, which had once been a place of necessity, now became a space where they shared more than just food. It became a space for connection. One day, as they sat around a table filled with freshly prepared food, a cowboy spoke up. His voice was light and friendly. "Anyone know how to make biscuits?" he asked, a small smile tugging at his lips. The women were silent, unsure whether to respond. Finally, one woman, her hands stiff from hunger and disuse, nodded. She had seen her mother bake bread before the war, though she hadn't done it in years. The cowboy crouched beside her, showing her how to sift the flour, mix the dough, and shape the biscuits. She worked slowly, at first unsure of herself, but as she kneaded the dough, she felt something shift inside. It was as though the act of baking was bringing her back to a place she had lost, a place of care, of warmth. The other women watched in silence. The idea of cooking with their captors felt strange, almost impossible. But the cowboy's calm, patient demeanor was different from what they had expected. He didn't bark orders or rush them. Instead, he guided them gently, treating them as equals. And for the first time, they began to realize something important. Cooking was more than just preparing food. It was an act of humanity, a way to bridge the gap between them and the men who had taken them captive. The women began to talk about their homes, their families, and the kitchens they had left behind. It was the first real conversation they had had with their captors. Later that evening, after the biscuits had baked and the smell of fresh bread filled the room, the women began to open up. One woman shared a memory of her own mother, who had always made enough food to feed everyone. Another woman told a story about her younger brother, who used to sneak into the kitchen to steal food. The laughter was hesitant at first, but as they shared their stories, something in the air shifted. The men, once distant and foreign, now seemed human, too. They had their own stories, their own families. And as the women laughed, it wasn't just at the stories, but at the realization that they were all more alike than they had thought. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on them. They had been taught to fear the enemy, to see them as ruthless, uncaring, and inhuman. But here they were, sitting at the same table, sharing a meal, laughing together. In that moment, they were no longer captives and captors. They were people, connecting over something as simple as food. The barriers between them started to fall, and though they were still prisoners, something deep inside them began to shift. By the end of the meal, they had all learned something important. Survival wasn't just about the food in their bellies. It was about the connections they made, the shared humanity that transcended borders, uniforms, and enemies. They weren't so different after all, and the simple act of cooking and eating together had shown them that the real battle wasn't on the battlefield, it was in the heart. One afternoon, a cowboy entered the mess hall with a homemade pie, holding it out toward one of the women. She hesitated, looking at the offering with suspicion. It wasn't just food, it was a gift, a symbol of something unexpected. Could she take it? Her mind raced with the old fears and beliefs. To accept something from the enemy was to surrender, wasn't it? She had been taught that surrender meant weakness, that accepting kindness from those who had captured them would make her less than what she was. But, despite her hesitation, she reached out and took the pie. The warmth of it in her hands felt like an act of defiance, quiet yet bold. She bit into it, and the sweetness overwhelmed her senses. It was the first time she had tasted sweetness in years. For a moment, she just sat there, chewing slowly, trying to process what this meant. It was a strange feeling. This sweetness wasn't just in the pie, it was in the rebellion it represented. This wasn't surrender, this was survival. Accepting the food didn't make her weak, it made her strong in a way she hadn't expected. She realized she had been fighting not just against the Cowboys, but against her own trauma, against the belief that she was nothing but a victim. This pie, this simple act, was her first step in reclaiming what had been taken from her, not her dignity, but her strength, her humanity. Around her, the other women watched, unsure of what to make of this new shift. They had all been conditioned to reject any kindness from their captors, to distrust anything that came from the enemy. But slowly, they began to see the pie differently. It wasn't a symbol of defeat, it was a symbol of resistance. In accepting it, she had refused to let the war strip away her identity. She had allowed herself to feel something again. Not just the sting of loss and hunger, but the warmth of a small human connection. As she finished the pie, the realization settled deeper within her. It wasn't just the food, it was the act itself. It was the cowboy's simple kindness. She could choose to live, to feel, and to reclaim parts of herself that the war had tried to steal. Slowly, the women began to talk to each other more, their voices quieter but filled with curiosity. They exchanged stories of their homes, of their mother's cooking, of the small acts of love they remembered before the war had changed everything. And then they laughed. It wasn't a loud, carefree laugh, but it was genuine. It was the kind of laugh that comes when you remember who you are, even after everything has been taken from you. The cowboy who had given the pie chuckled softly, as if realizing he had done something more than feed them, he had helped them heal, one small act at a time. That moment, simple as it was, became a turning point. The women weren't just surviving anymore, they were beginning to live again. They began to see their captors not as enemies, but as human beings, as people who shared a small piece of their world. And with that shift came a quiet rebellion not against the Cowboys, but against the trauma that had defined them for so long. Every moment of care, every act of kindness, was a small defiance against the war's attempt to break them. And with each day, they found themselves slowly reclaiming parts of themselves that they thought they had lost forever. The day the letters arrived felt strange. For some of the women, it was a relief, a chance to express their pain, their confusion, their longing. For others, it was a delicate act of betrayal. Could they really tell their families what had happened here? Could they admit the truth that the camp, once feared, had been a place of unexpected humanity? Could they say that the food, warmth, and kindness had chipped away at the walls they had built up? To write honestly was to acknowledge something they weren't ready to face. One woman wrote quickly, the words pouring out of her. She described the hunger, the initial fear, but also the warmth of the fire, the simple joy of a shared meal. She mentioned the kindness of a cowboy who had shown her how to cook, the respect shown to them, not as prisoners, but as human beings. Her words were full of surprise, a quiet admission that her captors were not what she had expected. It felt like a confession, a burden lifted, but also a contradiction. Could she really call these men kind? Could she truly write of their shared humanity without betraying everything she had been taught? Another woman, sitting beside her, stared at the blank page. She couldn't bring herself to write the truth. Instead, she described the camp as cold and harsh, omitting the warmth, the small moments of care that had begun to heal her. She couldn't reconcile the reality of her treatment with the beliefs she had grown up with. Writing the truth felt like an impossible betrayal. The letter she wrote was honest in its way, but it was incomplete. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the full story. As they wrote, they reflected on the transformation they had undergone. What had once seemed like a place of suffering had become something else, a place where they had been treated with unexpected dignity. The camp wasn't a paradise, but it wasn't a place of cruelty either. The meals, the quiet moments of rest, the simple acts of kindness had all added up, piece by piece, to a new understanding of their situation. They had arrived expecting to be broken, humiliated, but they had found humanity instead. It was this realization that made their letters so difficult to write. The truth they had been taught about their captors, about themselves, was unraveling. They had been taught that the enemy was heartless, that they would be treated as less than human, but their experiences were showing them something different. The men who had taken them captive were not so different from themselves, and as they wrote, each word felt like a quiet admission of that truth. The letters were not just messages home, they were a reflection of the growing distance between their wartime beliefs and the reality of their lived experiences. The women who had arrived as prisoners of war were beginning to understand that survival didn't just mean holding on to their pride. It meant accepting what had happened to them, learning from it, and finding new ways to live. Some letters never reached home. Some were left unwritten. But for the women who wrote, the process was a quiet reckoning. The war had changed them in ways they hadn't expected. They had arrived expecting to be victims, but they were leaving with something more, a deeper understanding of what it meant to survive, to heal, and to accept the unexpected kindness that came their way. One evening, as the light began to fade, the soft pluck of strings filled the air. The sound of a banjo, simple, haunting, and familiar, drifted over the camp. At first, the women sat in silence, unsure of what to make of the music. They had heard songs before, but this one was different. It wasn't the drumming of soldiers marching or the harsh commands of guards. This was something soft, something human. A cowboy, seated by the fire, had picked up the banjo and begun to play. It was a song they didn't recognize, a tune full of longing and simplicity, but it tugged at something deep inside them. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, they found themselves listening not with suspicion, but with a kind of quiet awe. The camp, which had always been filled with tension, fell into an odd stillness, as though even the wind had stopped to listen. And then something incredible happened. One of the women, her face still etched with the traces of war, let out a small, nervous laugh. It wasn't forced, but it felt almost foreign to her. The sound seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised the others. But once it started, it spread. The laugh was soft at first, tentative, but then another woman joined in, and soon the whole group was laughing. It was strange, almost disorienting, to laugh in such a place, but it was also healing. They laughed not because anything was funny, but because it felt good to feel something other than fear or anger. It was the kind of laugh they hadn't heard in years, genuine, unrestrained. It was the sound of reclaiming something they thought they had lost forever. The laughter lingered in the air, weaving through the camp. It wasn't just about the music. It was about what the music represented. It was a bridge between worlds. The banjo, with its simple, soulful tune, connected them to something beyond their captivity. It wasn't just a song, it was a way to remember that they were still human. For the first time in a long time, the women felt like people again, not just prisoners or tools of war. The music gave them a sense of belonging, of community. It didn't matter that they were on opposite sides of a war. In that moment, they shared something that transcended conflict. The deeper connection that began to form between the women and their captors wasn't immediately obvious, but it was undeniable. The laughter, the shared moment of peace in a place where there should have been none, became a turning point. As the song played on, the cowboys didn't just sit in silence. Some of them hummed along. Others tapped their feet to the rhythm. The act of playing music, of sharing a moment of joy, allowed them to connect in a way that nothing else had. The women, once fearful and distrustful, now saw the men not just as captors, but as human beings. The line between prisoner and guard had begun to blur, not because the roles had changed, but because the emotional distance between them had started to close. Laughter, they realized, was more than just a sound. It was a reclamation of humanity. For so long, they had been treated as less than human, first by the war, then by their captivity. But here, in the stillness of the camp, with the gentle strum of a banjo and the soft hum of voices joining together, they had reclaimed a piece of themselves. They had laughed not out of defiance, but out of something deeper, the need to remember that they were still alive, still capable of joy, and still capable of connecting with others. It was a moment of liberation, not from the camp, but from the mental and emotional prison they had been living in since the war began. As the music faded and the laughter subsided, the camp seemed quieter than it had ever been. The women, now calmer, exchanged glances, their expressions soft. For the first time, they felt something beyond fear, something like hope, something like healing. They had found a way to live again, even in captivity. If you are enjoying this story, please like the video and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The day of repatriation arrived sooner than they expected. The truck that had once brought them to the camp now stood waiting to take them away. For so long, they had dreamed of this moment, of returning home. But as they gathered their meager belongings, a sense of reluctance crept over them. They had been prisoners, yes, but they had also found something in this place that they hadn't known they were missing. The camp, despite its harshness, had become a strange refuge. It was where they had been fed, cared for, and treated with respect. It was where they had learned to laugh again, to share a meal, and to begin healing. Now, they were leaving it behind, and with it, the men who had shown them kindness. As they said their quiet goodbyes to the cowboys, something stirred within them. It wasn't just gratitude, it was a realization of how much they had changed. They stood taller than they had when they first arrived, their bodies stronger, their faces more alive. The hollow, gaunt figures they had once been were slowly being replaced by women who had begun to reclaim their dignity. The fear that had defined their lives for so long had been chipped away, piece by piece, and in its place stood something more resilient, something like hope, something like pride. They had come to this camp as shadows of themselves, and now they were leaving as women who knew their worth. The physical transformation was obvious, more meat on their bones, strength in their movements, but the emotional transformation was even more profound. They had been hollowed out by the war, by fear, and by hunger, but now they were filled with something else, something that had been buried under the weight of their suffering. The goodbye was quiet, almost reverent. The women, once so unwilling to show emotion, now allowed themselves the release of a soft, wordless farewell. The cowboys, who had once been nothing more than captors, were now a part of their story, a chapter they would carry with them long after they left. One cowboy, the one who had shared his music with them, offered a silent nod. Another gave a slight smile, as if acknowledging the shared humanity that had passed between them. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic goodbyes, just a simple, quiet understanding that the women were leaving with something they hadn't had when they arrived: their dignity. As they climbed into the truck and the engine roared to life, the women looked back at the camp, their hearts heavy but filled with something new. They were leaving behind a place that had once been a prison, but now, in their hearts, it would always be a place where they had learned to heal. The world they were returning to was no longer the one they had known. The war had changed, everything changed them, but they had changed too. They were no longer just victims of war. They had been transformed into women who had survived, who had found their strength again. The journey home was long, but it wasn't filled with the same dread that had accompanied their journey here. They sat in silence, each woman lost in her thoughts. What would they find when they returned home? What would be left of the world they once knew? The war had taken so much from them, but it had also given them something they hadn't expected: a deeper understanding of who they were. They were no longer just survivors, they were women who had learned to live again. When they arrived at their destination, there was no fanfare, no crowd waiting for them, just the quiet, lonely truth that the world had moved on, and so had they. They returned home not just with food in their stomachs, but with a sense of identity and dignity they had almost forgotten. The war had stripped away so much, but it had also given them a strength they hadn't known they possessed. And as they walked off the truck, they did so with their heads held high, ready to face the world again, not as broken women, but as survivors. The world they returned to was different, yet familiar. There were no crowds, no celebrations. It was just them, the women who had been broken, rebuilt, and returned. As they stepped back into their lives, they realized how deeply the lessons they had learned in the camp would never leave them. The bacon, the laughter, the human connection they had experienced with their captors lingered in their minds, haunting them in a way they couldn't have anticipated. How had they been treated with such kindness by the very people they had been taught to fear? How could they reconcile that with everything they had learned growing up? The questions gnawed at them, but the answers remained elusive. They knew one thing for certain: they had changed. The reckoning with their previous beliefs came quietly. They had been taught that the enemy was ruthless, that they were nothing more than tools of war. They had been raised to see their captors as monsters, as people who would stop at nothing to break them. But the reality had been different. The kindness shown to them in the camp, the simple acts of shared humanity, these were things they could never unsee. The men who had fed them, who had played music for them, who had treated them with respect, how could they reconcile that with the hatred they had been taught? They found themselves questioning everything they had once believed about the world, about their country, and about themselves. The war had taught them to hate, to fear. But the camp had taught them something else: that survival wasn't just about enduring, about holding on to old beliefs. It was about being open to change, to the possibility that the world was not as simple as they had once thought. The kindness they had received had left a lasting imprint on their souls. It wasn't something they could forget, no matter how hard they tried. The simple acts of care, the quiet respect, had given them a new sense of self-worth. For so long, they had been reduced to their status as prisoners. But now, they carried with them the memory of those moments, those small acts of kindness that had proven they were more than their circumstances. It was a quiet revolution inside them, a shift from seeing themselves as victims to recognizing that they were survivors. They were not defined by their captivity, by the war, or by the wounds they had carried. They were defined by their ability to see the world differently, to understand that kindness, no matter where it came from, had the power to heal. As they faced the world again, they realized something else. True survival wasn't just about enduring the hardships of war or captivity. It wasn't just about holding on to what they had lost. True survival was about their capacity to change, to adapt, to embrace the humanity that was still left in the world. They had survived not by clinging to old beliefs, but by accepting new truths. They had learned that survival meant acknowledging the unexpected kindness of others, even those they had been taught to fear. They had learned that survival was not just about strength, it was about vulnerability, about allowing themselves to feel the human connections that transcended war, that transcended fear. And as they moved forward into a world that had changed while they had been locked away, they carried these lessons with them. They would never forget the bacon, the laughter, or the soft, unexpected moments that had rebuilt them. The war had taken so much, but it had also given them something they hadn't known they needed. The understanding that survival was not just about the body, it was about the heart, about the soul, and about the capacity to change. If this story moved you, please like the video and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts.